everyone. I'm Sophie Adams from the School of Humanities and Languages and the Centre for Social Research in Health here at UNSW. Welcome to this lecture, Generations of Slow Violence, the Persistent Challenge of Lead Pollution by Professor Abby Kinchy, which is hosted by the UNSW Science and Society Research Group and AusSTS Sydney. We are, of course, gathering for this lecture today on the unceded lands of the Bejigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge their custodianship of this land, their elders past, present and emerging, as well as any First Nations people here with us today. Abby's going to be talking to us about slow violence, which, of course, this country has seen no small amount of, so I invite you to reflect on that history as we listen to Abby today. So Abby, who we're very fortunate to have visiting us, is a Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in the US. Her research currently addresses three main topics: public participation in scientific research, subterranean resource politics, and the governance of environmental pollution. Across all these topics, she examines how knowledge is created and mobilised, whether by polluting industries, institutions of democratic governance, or the diverse publics affected by technological change. Her first book was Seeds, Science and Struggle, The Global Politics of Transgenic Crops, which concerned the question of genetic contamination of traditional plant varieties in Mexico and Canada. Subsequently, she led the Watershed Knowledge Mapping Project, which examined the practices and politics of volunteer stream monitoring in the context of shale gas development, or fracking. And this project led her to co-organise STS Underground, a research network that advances social science research on the techno-scientific dimensions of mining, burial and other forms of subterranean exploration. Expanding on the lessons learned in these projects, she co-authored a book on citizen science with Aya H. Kimura called Science by the People, Participation, Power and the Politics of Environmental Knowledge. Her newest project, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly, Nuestros Suelos, Our Soil, explores how citizen science could help urban communities to identify heavy metal contamination in soil and to advocate for solutions. She's currently on sabbatical conducting research in Australia about the lead industry. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that great introduction. And this microphone seems really loud, but okay, everyone's hearing me. Great. I can speak quietly and you'll still catch it. Thank you for that kind introduction and for giving the land acknowledgement. I'm really grateful to all of my hosts here, and I also hope that my talk today will contribute to the project of telling the truth about the violence of settler colonialism. I want to note that I'm here in Australia to learn, and my presentation today will reflect where I am in that process, and so I really welcome what everyone here can teach me. So when I was invited to speak and then given the theme of generation, I realized it was really a great theme for an STS conference because it evokes such a wide range of ideas, as we've certainly seen over the last 2 days of this workshop. We often use the word generation to simply mean production or creation, but this could refer to new ideas or it could refer to hazardous waste, right? It could be a whole range of products of human activity. And then there are generations in the sense of kinship, right? Grandmother, mother, daughter, granddaughter. And in STS, we have often addressed these ideas in terms of reproductive technologies, but also in terms of intergenerational ethics. And we can also think of generations in terms of cohorts. For example, every scientist who was at the peak of their career during the Vietnam War, or people who came of age during the AIDS crisis. So when we are doing histories of science and technology, these groupings are also really important. And then finally, there are the metaphorical senses of generation that many of us have been working with. We constantly hear these ideas in the hype for new technology, right? Next generation biotech, Web 3.0, and so forth. And STS, I think, does a really good job of interrogating these metaphors and how they shape imaginaries of progress and the future. So I was thinking about all these different ideas of generation when I came across a press release from the Consortium for Battery Innovation. This is a research sponsor. It's a pretty new organization, and it was created by the international lead industry. And the main purpose is to make the case that lead is the right material to use for electric vehicle batteries and other kinds of new batteries. So for solar energy storage, e-bike batteries, other new energy systems. But a key problem, of course, is that lead is a well-known poison. Countless generations have been exposed to lead, altering their brains and other organs, affecting their reproduction. The World Health Organization says there's no known safe level of lead exposure. Even very low concentrations of lead in the blood can permanently affect a child's cognitive abilities. It can affect their learning, their attention, their hearing and speech, and other aspects of development. And then at higher levels of exposure, lead can cause anemia, kidney problems, high blood pressure. And these are all conditions that are often attributed to other causes in adults, so we sometimes don't make the connection with lead. Now, advocates of lead batteries typically sidestep the question of, here are some examples of lead residues, typically sidestep the problem of lead pollution by sort of relegating all those harms into the past. They emphasize engineering interventions at mining, smelting, and recycling sites that decrease the release of lead into the environment, distinguishing current operations from the polluters of the past. So for example, in this book, Lead Acid Batteries for Future Automobiles, the concluding chapter says, great effort is made worldwide to ensure that the production, use, and recycling of lead-acid batteries is conducted under rigorous standards of health and safety. Modern technologies reduce the contact of humans with lead to a minimum. In some countries, however, factories are still using outdated technologies. So the implication here, of course, is that with present-day technologies, lead production is not a health threat. Lead poisoning is only a problem of the past and outdated technologies. Now, it's true that regulations and new technologies have made a tremendous difference. Notably, blood lead levels have significantly declined since leaded gasoline was phased out. And certainly more technical interventions could reduce future exposures around industrial lead sites like mines and smelters. But we already live in a lead-saturated world. And once in the environment, lead takes hundreds of years to break down. So as we imagine next generation transportation and energy systems, we can't pretend that the past generations of lead production are really left in the past. So the art exhibition, Lead in My Grandmother's Body, emphasizes and expands upon this point. The paintings and photographs are made in protest against the McArthur River Mine, a controversial lead and zinc mining venture in the Northern Territory. The website for the project makes explicit connections between cellular violence in the Northern Territory and the ongoing slow violence of environmental destruction and lead poisoning. And the three Aboriginal artists are also looking to the future. So the artist statement says, "Lead in My Grandmother's Body challenges viewers to think differently about wealth, not as a short-term thing resulting from damaging extractive processes, but a wealth that is intergenerational, encompassing people, culture, and country that will sustain them all into deep futures." So when we juxtapose the pursuit of next-generation batteries with lead's catastrophic legacies, we are faced with a fundamental challenge. How can we reckon with past and present harms when envisioning next-generation technologies, and maybe even deep futures? So I want to suggest to you that we can use different meanings of generation as sensitizing concepts for thinking through this problem. So like the artist that I just mentioned, I'm going to use the concept of slow violence to talk about lead today and the rest of this talk. So Rob Nixon uses this phrase to describe the many attritional catastrophes that do grave harm to bodies, environments, and communities though they're hard to categorize as events or acts. These are temporally and spatially amorphous phenomena. So climate change, exposures to toxic chemicals, and degradation of ecological systems all fall in this category of slow violence. They're slow in comparison to other acts of violence, so they're rarely registered as violence at all. Now, as a literary scholar, Nixon examines how novelists and essayists have sought to represent these catastrophes, to rouse people to action. So I'm going to read from this lengthy quote from the book. In an age when the media venerate the spectacular, when public policy is shaped primarily around perceived immediate need, a central question is strategic and representational. How can we convert into image and narrative the disasters that are slow-moving and long in the making? Disasters that are anonymous and that star nobody. Disasters that are attritional and of indifferent interest to the sensation-driven technologies of our image world. How can we turn the long emergencies of slow violence into stories dramatic enough to rouse public sentiment and warrant political intervention? These emergencies whose repercussions have given rise to some of the most critical challenges of our time. So I've noticed that many working in STS are now taking on the kind of challenge that Nixon describes here. While controversy studies have been a staple of STS analysis, my own included, these often deal with dramatic stories, important figures, and significant events. So can we instead examine the slow disasters that star nobody? Well, we're seeing through studies of plastics, asthma, PFAS, fracking, and other topics, we're seeing really this crucial turn in our field toward representations of slow violence. These studies are populated with scientists, activists, and ordinary people who are working to apprehend these amorphous threats. So in this vein, I've been studying lead for the past few years by making a few different interventions. I've been studying how scientists are disturbing what Michelle Murphy calls regimes of imperception around lead exposures. I've immersed myself through reading and interviews in the eclectic and loosely organized network of scientists who are studying lead contamination in soil, which has often been ignored as a cause of lead poisoning. And I've also been working to disturb regimes of imperception myself by launching a community-based participatory study of soil contamination in the city where I live, in Troy, New York, in the United States, and also in a few other sites around the world. These research interventions are beginning to teach me how not knowing about environmental lead arises from a confluence of social forces, which vary across countries and regions. So this has been a long introduction, but I'm going to tell you now about what's going to happen in the rest of this talk. So first, we're going to consider the processes that generate toxic lead contamination. Next, I'm going to introduce the multi-generational nature of the scientific work that has disrupted regimes of imperception around lead exposure. And then I'm going to talk about an example of intergenerational harm and the ways that mothers are demanding justice. And finally, I'm going to present an example of regeneration as urban gardeners build healthy soils, protecting their communities from lead dust in the process. And so throughout, I'm going to draw attention to the institutional support that's needed to sustain multi-generational resistance to slow violence. So let's start with the generation of lead residues. Now, in some ways, lead is the paradigmatic case of slow violence. It does profound harm to bodies, but its accretion into environments is slow and stealthy, and it sticks around for an extremely long time. Yet, despite all we know about lead's dangers, the generation of environmental lead is part of the maintenance of a particular social order. As Tess Lee writes, rocks have to be blasted, trees have to be removed, creatures have to die, other life has to be withered, so that we, a raced, classed, and geocolonizing collective, can get the goods we desire and depend on. So as I mentioned at the start of this talk, lead is today mainly used to manufacture automotive batteries. There is a massive recycling industry for these batteries, but our expanding consumption of batteries in cars and trucks demands a continuous supply of new lead. Now, lead is mined primarily in China, Australia, the United States, and Peru. Australia has the world's largest lead reserves, though China far surpasses Australia in lead extraction. Whatever the future uses of lead, it's clear that the end of lead mining is a long way off. In Australia, the government estimates 74 more years of lead supply just from operating mines. And when all known lead deposits are included, this estimate rises to 125 years, right? So these are all these sites where lead could potentially be extracted here in Australia. The communities around lead mines and smelters typically have high levels of lead exposure, though these industries often avoid responsibility for it. Lead recycling can also be problematic. For example, in Los Angeles, there's a battery recycling plant that contaminated thousands of properties with lead. UNICEF, in this report, reports that battery recycling worldwide has created dangerous levels of lead exposure for millions of children. Taking all of the sources of lead together, this report concludes that around 1/3 of the world's children are being exposed to lead at alarming levels. Beyond batteries, lead has numerous uses. It has for thousands of years. Lead house paint and leaded pipes are in many of our homes, and because of the difficulty and the expense of removing these leaded materials, anyone living in a home built before the 1970s or even before 1980 probably lives intimately with lead, right? Most of us do here. And past uses of lead accumulate in soils. Peeling paint, industrial emissions, and leaded gasoline or petrol are the major culprits. In the United States, it's estimated that the combustion of leaded fuel from the 1920s through the 1990s deposited 4 to 5 million tons of lead into the environment. And because lead takes many hundreds of years to break down, it will remain in the soil along roads and highways throughout urban neighborhoods for the long foreseeable future. And the impact is similar in Australia and everywhere people drove cars throughout the 20th century. So why does it matter that it's in soils? Well, contaminated soils enter bodies through numerous pathways. Some kids, like mine here, put soil in their mouths. Thanks, Aldo, for this great image. But people also eat garden vegetables without fully washing off every particle of soil. Children playing outdoors put dirty hands or toys in their mouths. Hi, come on in. Yeah. People track dirt onto floors where children play. Dry conditions create dust that's then inhaled, or the dust coats surfaces inside the home that then children put into their mouths. So I want to make the case here that accepting and ignoring this pervasive lead pollution has been necessary for the maintenance of our current social order, just like Tesley suggested. And here I lean on other thinkers who are working to make sense of the generation of toxic harms. So, this is saying installation in progress. Okay, that's done. Okay, it's done, it's cleared. Liberone, Tironi, and Calvillo describe the generation of toxic harms as processes that are operating at different scales. They write, toxic harm can be understood as the contravention of order at one scale and the reproduction of order at another. So chronic low levels of arsenic in water interrupt the reproduction of fish, but maintain the ability of mining companies to store mining tailings in open air mounds. In other words, generation of toxic threats is not just a technical process of dumping or dispersing waste. It is a social process of creating and maintaining an industry and a particular way of life, achieved by shifting the scale of disruption. So the lead industry continually maintains its ability to move lead into global markets through social acceptance of chronic low levels of lead exposure. And but what we found through some other studies, particularly by work by Marianne Sullivan and Donna Green here at this university, that public health advice often doesn't acknowledge the public health threat of low levels of lead exposure. So, for instance, they did a study of public health advice in mining and smelting communities in Australia. So they indicated that the Broken Hill Lead Health Program stated that their objective was minimizing the impact of lead exposure whilst maintaining a viable mining industry in Broken Hill. Likewise, in Mount Isa, the emphasis was on making it clear that Mount Isa is a safe place to live. And finally, in Port Pirie, a smelting community, the emphasis was on keeping blood lead levels as low as possible, but of course not eliminating blood lead exposures. So the social acceptance of lead does not only happen in mining and smelting communities. US lawmakers have repeatedly decided that coordinated prevention of lead exposures is too expensive. In the book Lead Wars, Rosner and Markowitz write, more than 35 studies were done during the 1980s and 1990s about various lead abatement strategies. Yet despite the evidence compiled, by the turn of the 21st century, policymakers were unwilling to commit the needed resources to finally remove lead from children's homes. And the courts were unwilling to hold accountable the companies responsible for this ecological and human tragedy. So as I said, today, homes across the US, and presumably Australia as well, remain polluted with lead paint, pipes, and contaminated soil. And so doctors and public health authorities like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention advise parents to take precautions, such as avoiding peeling paint, frequently cleaning up dust that accumulates in the home because it might contain lead particles. Rather than investing in safe housing and infrastructure, these systemic problems have become the responsibility of individuals, few of whom can afford the necessary interventions or invest in transforming their homes into lead-safe places. So, as in Mount Isa, people across urban communities are advised to live with lead. But normalization and acceptance of environmental lead has always been contested. So, as I've alluded to already, there have been generations of concerned scientists that have raised alarms about the industrial uses of lead. The persistence of critical scientists over several generations is a really important story in the history of science that I think deserves deeper understanding. So in 1909, a noted Brisbane pediatrician, Dr. Alfred Jeffries Turner, published a detailed account of childhood lead poisoning symptoms in the British Medical Journal. He concluded with a plea for legislative action, saying it was no longer excusable to claim ignorance about the harms caused by leaded paint. Now, following Dr. Turner's pleas for intervention, Queensland actually did ban the manufacture of lead paint in 1923. But the rest of Australia did not follow suit for decades longer after that. And indeed, legislative action to protect public health has really been slow to develop everywhere, even when scientists have presented compelling evidence of lead's harms. Action on lead has been repeatedly undermined by lead industry misinformation and lobbying. So in my research, I have wondered what sustains critical scientists in the face of industry opposition and legislative neglect. When contending with slow violence, critical scientists have to pass knowledge as well as fortitude from one academic generation to the next. And I want to give an example of this. There's a great story of the relationship between Alice Hamilton and Harriet Hardy, examined really nicely in a paper by Marianne Sullivan, and it gives a glimpse into these kinds of mentoring relationships. So Alice Hamilton was born to a privileged American family in 1869. She became a pioneer in the emerging field of industrial toxicology, and she was a sharp critic of industries that exposed their workers to toxic hazards. She warned repeatedly against the dangers of adding lead to fuel when American auto and chemical manufacturers began to introduce tetraethyl lead to gasoline in 1923. But the US government's official study of the lead poisoning risks of this new kind of fuel concluded that the risk to the public was minimal. Now, in retrospect, this is probably not a surprising finding since the study was carried out in partnership with DuPont Corporation, which is manufacturing tetraethyl lead. And at the time, Hamilton and other industrial hygienists and public health scientists offered strong critiques of that study. But many members of the public health community concluded that without definitive proof of harm, there was no reason to deter the growth of the new and now growing automotive industry in the United States. So ultimately, leaded fuel was allowed to be marketed and remained on the market in the US until the 1990s. Well, Hamilton went on to have, she had a really important career. She is considered sort of the mother of occupational toxicology. And she wrote one of the most important textbooks on occupational health and medicine. It was first published in 1934. But in 1946, it was time to prepare a second edition. And so she invited a young scientist named Harriet Hardy to be her co-author. Hardy was early in her career, and she was doing groundbreaking work on the effects of workplace exposure to beryllium. In the years after co-authoring the second edition of Industrial Toxicology, Hamilton remained a mentor to Hardy, frequently sending her letters of praise and encouragement. Well, Hardy went on to have a great career. She was appointed to positions at MIT and Harvard Medical School at a time when few, if any, women had similar roles. So if Alice Hamilton represented the first generation of public health critique of the lead industry, Harriet Hardy inherited that cause from her. Now, compared to Hamilton, Hardy took a more neutral stance with regard to management and labor. Hamilton was a little bit more of a labor activist. But she stuck to the science that was critical of lead and introducing lead into the environment. And in the 1960s, she presented strong scientific arguments against the lead industry. Now you have to think about the context in 1966. There was a massive wave of social movement organizing in the United States throughout the 1960s and into the 70s. And in that context, responding to lead poisoning as a matter of social justice was becoming a really urgent policy matter. So in response, the lead industry was advocating the idea of a safe threshold level of lead in the body, saying there's a certain amount that the body can bear without issues. But Hardy, now by this time a well-established and leading expert, made the case that much lower levels of exposure to lead could do significant harm to vulnerable populations, such as children and pregnant women. And so these arguments would become crucial to subsequent advocacy to finally remove lead from gasoline. Now, the mentoring relationship between Hamilton and Hardy is notable because there were few opportunities for women to become scientists in their time, and they were each highly regarded and influential. But I think important to what I want to talk about today here is that they also show how in a very long struggle against a pollutant like lead, relationships between scientific generations are crucial. So in my research on American scientists who are working with communities to test soils for lead and other metals, I found that many people who are doing this work today took inspiration from, collaborated with, and were mentored by one groundbreaking researcher, Howard Mielke, this man up here in the corner. Mielke began studying the relationship between lead in soil and children's blood lead levels in the 1980s, and over the years has become one of the most outspoken critics of public health policies that fail to address the dangers posed by lead-contaminated soil. So following in his path today, there are a growing number of scientists that are establishing soil testing projects in the cities where they work, often connected to their universities, but doing community-engaged projects. This is a really eclectic research community. They're not all soil scientists or trained as soil scientists. They might come out of geochemistry, environmental health science, even science education, engineering, right? It's a wide range of people that have taken inspiration from Mielke and others like him. And many of these, like Mielke, are highly attuned to the histories of racism and class-based oppression that shape patterns of lead accretion in the United States. So Mielke is now retiring from his position at Tulane University. And I talked to one of his young collaborators about what this might mean for the future of research on lead in soil. And she emphasized institution building and the importance of that. She said, soil lead research appears to be at an inflection point. And she emphasized that there's a need for shoring up capacity to sustain environmental justice research at universities. And she was hopeful, saying, I think there's more and more realizable potential for universities to channel resources in ways that address fundamental injustices. Universities certainly could do much more to actively support environmental justice research. And I also think that the next generation of lead research has to be more inclusive and extend beyond the walls of our research institutions. So this is why I, along with a team of other academics, started what we called the Our Soil Project. So the instigator of this project was Sebastián Ureta, who is a sociologist in Chile. And he was starting to organize do-it-yourself, or do-it-together, really, soil testing workshops in Chilean communities impacted by mining waste. And so his team came up with the idea, the title, or the name of the project, Nuestros Suelos, Our Soils. After we teamed up, we started improving this very beginning array of do-it-yourself soil testing tools, focusing on lead and arsenic. And our approach has been to develop a comprehensive set of organizing tools, not just testing devices, with the idea of developing a widening cohort of community-based soil experts. So this is, in a way, our effort to mentor the next generation and beyond the academic walls right, of our universities. So throughout this project, which has taken us to communities in the city where I live, in Troy, and also in Chile, and I did some soil testing with gardeners in England as well. I may do some soil testing with people here. Throughout this project, we've started to grapple with questions of intergenerational justice. So one of the places where we did this work is in the city of Arica in Chile, northern Chile. It's a port city in the far north of Chile, if you can think of it as that long strip of land. It's way at the very top. Arica is in a desert. It receives basically no rainfall each year. And so the soil is extremely dry and dusty, and plants only grow where there's irrigation in place. It has a lot of train traffic, both from Chile and Bolivia, bringing mined materials through the city to the shipping port. It goes out to the sea. It's also the site where, in the mid-1980s, a major Swedish mining company, Boliden, sent 20,000 tons of toxic waste from one of its copper and lead smelters. This was ostensibly for reprocessing by a Chilean company, but no further processing was done. Now, I don't really have time to go into all the details of this very complex case, but the important thing to know is that the waste had really high concentrations of lead, arsenic, and other metals. And it sat uncovered for many years in the middle of a low-income neighborhood. Now, the Chilean government has taken actions to move the waste to another location, but it's not that far away. And they have tried to relocate some people from the really highly contaminated homes. So here's a couple of images. While we were there last November, this is an attempt at remediating, or they're just removing a bunch of soil from one street. And those are some homes that are being demolished. Unfortunately, however, this hasn't solved all the problems. Last year, this is making noise. I'll go back. Last year, a team of experts appointed by the United Nations to investigate the case made these conclusions. I don't know if it's noisy. The residents of Arica continue to suffer serious health problems caused by the waste dump. The community has been denied access to justice for years, received little or no remediation, and even today, those in need of medical care are ignored. So these experts appointed by the UN estimated that 12,000 people have been affected by the waste, including deaths. Effects of exposure include cancer, joint pain, respiratory difficulties, allergies, and anemia. The UN noted that some women of reproductive age who played on the waste pile as children have been unable to conceive, and pregnancies that occur often result in miscarriage and birth defects. So, as I said, last November I went to Arica along with other members of the Our Soil team to hold a soil testing workshop with members of this community. A local community organizer recruited 11 adults, mostly women, to participate. And the activities took place over 3 days at a church that was located just blocks away from the former toxic waste site. And the results, I will say, I found disturbing. Every sample that was collected from across the city contained arsenic, and we later confirmed this with laboratory testing. We were relieved, but actually kind of surprised to find few samples containing high concentrations of lead, and we're actually returning again in November, and we'll do more research, more investigation. So in some ways, the soil testing raised as many questions as it answered. The one thing that the participants repeatedly said at the end of the workshops was that doing the soil testing strengthened their confidence in contradicting authorities who try to minimize the pollution problems in Arica. So on our next trip there, our goal is actually to try to help set up resources for further soil testing that locals can manage themselves. So some of the workshop participants were mothers from a group called Mamitas del Plomo, or Mamas of Lead. The organization, started in 2019, consists of a small group of mothers who are organizing to demand health services. As I sort of suggested earlier, that previously the Chilean government did make some interventions that included passing a law that was meant to attend to the toxic waste problem, providing health services, but only to children who were born in a certain date range. So you could say they were kind of drawing a boundary around the contamination event. But as in all forms of slow violence, Boleden's assault on Arica overspills these temporal and spatial boundaries. So remember that many women today were children playing on the toxic waste dump. The Mamitas del Plomo successfully fought for testing services for a larger pool of Arica's children. They just had blood testing done recently. And they're continuing to demand high quality health services. So this is very much an ongoing campaign. And these mothers, I think, present a striking contrast to those mothers that are imagined or envisioned in health guidance documents. Women and caregivers more generally are typically positioned as responsible for lead poisoning prevention through careful cleaning and diligent nutritional provision. Now, certainly the Mamitas del Plomo take care to keep contaminated soil away from their children, but they're also demanding accountability and justice. So their efforts, along with other protesters over the last 2 decades, have made the slow violence in Arica into an urgent call for action. So let's talk about soils. In Arica, the soil is dry, almost powdery, and water is too expensive for most to use for irrigation. While the wealthy parts of town have grass and flowers, the homes around the former waste site are surrounded by bare, dusty soil. Without changing these soil conditions, it will be very difficult to reduce exposures to the contaminants in these soils. This brings us to another meaning of generation, or really regeneration. How can we regenerate the liveliness and life-giving qualities of degraded, contaminated soils? It might seem that gardening would be off limits in lead-contaminated soils, but some environmental scientists are beginning to see gardening not as in conflict with urban soil contamination, but as a solution to it. So Kirsten Schwartz and her colleagues at UCLA explain the addition of organic matter via compost or manures may also reduce potential lead exposure by tightly binding lead, making it less bioavailable, and by helping to establish vegetation that acts as a barrier between contaminated soil and humans. In other words, remediation of lead-contaminated soil can be reframed as regeneration of healthy human-soil relations. As we tried to represent in this comic, which was part of the Our Soil project. So we wrote a comic book to share throughout our city, especially going door to door to find people who might be interested in participating in a community soil study. Now, repairing relations with soil requires a community science that goes beyond measuring hazards in the environment. We have to situate pollutants in a socio-ecological web, as we started to talk about here. But there's a dilemma here, right? How do we repair relations with soils that have the potential to do us bodily harm? In the Our Soil project, we had to navigate tensions between soil appreciation and recognizing soil-based risks. For example, touching and smelling enables us to discover soil's liveliness and diversity, but in the context of a study of toxic metal contamination, such intimate engagement with soil can feel dangerous. So I'm going to describe some moments from our workshop in Troy, New York. In the lull between active steps of the arsenic test, participants gathered by a dirt pile containing old bits of old brick, rock, grass, and soil of various colors and textures left from an unfinished landscaping project. Crouching, Salvatore, my colleague here, encouraged participants to use their bare hands so they could feel the texture of the soil through their fingers. Some of the participants seemed skeptical or confused at first. At least one refused to handle the soil, but most followed his lead. Moving the soil with his fingers and holding it up for closer examination, Salvatore asked the group, "What do you see in it? What is the soil like?" Holding the soil closer to their faces, a few participants saw insects or bits of twigs in the samples. Seeming to relax and become increasingly interested in the activity, one of the participants pointed out that the soil is soft and feels fresh. Through a series of guided observations, participants started to recognize soil textures and particle sizes. Salvatore explained that the soil's stickiness comes from humus, organic matter, which is charged and chemically active. Connecting soil health back to heavy metal contamination, he said that if heavy metals don't attach to materials like humus, they can flow into the water in the soil, which is then taken up by plants. So changing soils by adding compost, manure, and other organic materials can keep plants from absorbing heavy metals. To demonstrate some of these ideas in practice, Noelani, one of the workshop participants, gave an impromptu tour of Collard's City Garden, a communal neighborhood garden. The garden was built on an empty lot near a busy street, and rubble from demolished buildings often turns up in the soil. These are all signals of likely lead contamination. To inexperienced eyes, the garden in summer appeared overgrown and chaotic, and some participants seemed initially overwhelmed. Fruit trees and grapevines were interspersed with perennial food crops and flowers, as well as rows of annual vegetables such as tomatoes and lettuce. Narrow trails wound around raised beds of multiple shapes and sizes, bordered by rocks, tires, wood chips, boards, and other building materials. Noelani explained that this approach to biodiverse gardening, sometimes called permaculture, was rooted in the tropical indigenous culture in which she grew up and her knowledge of Afro-Indigenous farming methods. Now, Noelani's young children both have high blood lead levels, and the public health department has been hounding her family, demanding that she find a solution. Now, their old home is likely exposing everyone in the family to lead dust, but there's only so much that she and her husband can afford to repair. And in the communal garden, Noelani explained that when the garden was first created, soil tests indicated lead contamination. So they made interventions like building raised beds, incorporating a lot of compost, laying down wood chips to cover the bare paths. They also took care not to grow leafy greens or root vegetables in places where they weren't sure about the soil safety, because these crops are more likely to take up lead. But in our workshops, soil samples from the garden had no detectable lead, which suggests that the ongoing work with the soil, despite its initial impurity, has made it a safer place to grow food. These soil regeneration methods contrast with remediation strategies that are commonly used at highly polluted sites, such as excavating contaminated soils or creating an impermeable cap over the contaminated area. Organic barriers like mulch and raised beds encourage the continued interaction with and care for soils, despite a legacy of contamination. They require a strong relationship between humans and soil as materials decompose and require new layers. And plants, like grass or perennial flowers, require water, pruning, and the addition of organic matter. So care for contaminated soil requires perpetual attention. And this is a dilemma in a neighborhood where many residents are transient, renting their homes and moving on when their circumstances change. Gray, Cosgrove, Lieberon, and Lepowski critique the concept of perpetual care because, quote, it does not necessarily account for slow violence, slow disaster, and environmental or social justice. The labor of perpetual care in irradiated zones, for instance, would again fall on the shoulders of the very people affected by radioactive waste in the first place, fence line and downwind communities. So, the labor of maintaining barriers between contaminated soils and the people who live and play on them generally falls to those who are already most burdened by toxic urban environments. Collecting wood chips, caring for grass or other plants, checking for bare patches of soil, these are tasks that fall to those at risk of exposure, rather than the polluters, and they're insufficiently supported with public funding. Now, these forms of care can be rewarding, providing mutual benefits to people, soils, and other living things. I think Noelani and other people who participated in the College City Garden would say so. But without funding, encouragement, and access to resources, few people are able to commit to such practices. So I'm going to just start wrapping up here. As Dr. Turner wrote in 1909, ignorance of the evil of lead poisoning is no longer excusable. That was 1909. Yet the generation of environmental lead has been an inherent part of building and maintaining a social order that depends on cars for transportation, high energy consumption, and natural resource extraction for economic growth. The longevity of the lead industry has depended in part on successfully pursuing next generation products, like the new kinds of lead batteries it promotes today. As STS scholars, we should be paying attention to those engineers and research institutions who are dedicated to prolonging the life of the lead industry. Today, though, I've mainly focused on the communities that disrupt social acceptance of lead exposure and the healers of the wounds of slow violence. Generations of scientists have called for regulations on the lead industry. Caregivers are fighting for intergenerational justice in places heavily burdened by lead pollution. And gardeners are regenerating healthy soils in polluted urban neighborhoods. All these forms of knowledge making over long time scales have made lead exposure apprehensible and urgent. We have to find ways to actively support these communities and practices if we're ever going to end lead's slow violence. So throughout this talk, I've drawn attention to the needs for funding, organization, and institution building. Scientists require lasting support for environmental justice research to sustain them over generations. Communities affected by pollution require both testing resources and health services. And soil regeneration projects require organizational support and funding to ensure that perpetual care can be sustained. So I'm going to leave this here. I want to thank a great number of collaborators and supporters in this project. And I'm now going to turn to you for discussion, questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby, for a fascinating talk. We've now got some time for questions and discussion. Matt is going to run around with the microphone, but before I give it to him, I've got one question for you, Abby.
Okay.
And that's can you tell us a little bit more about how this project you've told us about, our Soils project, connects to, perhaps builds upon, or even differs from some of your previous work on citizen science?
Yeah. So if so if anybody knows my previous work, before I started working on this project, I was doing a lot of research about volunteer water monitoring in the context of natural gas development, and that led me to write a book called Science by the People, looking at the politics of environmental citizen science. And in all of that work, well, sometimes I was a participant observer. I was mostly, just observing citizen science projects, not instigating them myself. And I was often writing critically about some of the dilemmas that arise in trying to use citizen science for scientific research, as well as creating social change. And I'm not sure I ever had an intention of actually becoming a citizen science practitioner myself, but because I was having lots of conversations with people about the politics of citizen science, particularly in the context of the fossil fuel industry, I suppose it made sense that Sebastián Oreda reached out to me when he was working on issues around mining waste in Chile and asked if I had any ideas about how we could use citizen science in a community that was where institutional science really wasn't doing anything. Like there wasn't the government or the research community wasn't helping people address the issues they were facing. So so it was kind of a big step to decide we would actually go from just observing and writing about citizen science to actually trying to create a project that tried to live up to some of the ideals that I sort of began to set out in my writing about citizen science. And I think it's been, it's been a really rewarding process. And I think it has actually been helpful to start off my work in citizen science as an STS scholar, because we sort of came prepared to ask questions about what are the social, cultural, and political implications of engaging with scientific tools in different ways, different configurations. And one of the things that I was writing about a lot about citizen science was about the scale of intervention with citizen science, right? The dilemma between focusing on like hyper-local observations when the root of environmental problems is something big and global, like multinational corporations, and how do we think about moving between those scales? So it was actually really useful, I think, to start off with an STS framework and analysis of citizen science when actually trying to create a citizen science or community participatory science ourselves. But it's, it means that I'm kind of doing this, like we're writing about ourselves in the same way that I was writing about other people's citizen science projects. Like I'm trying to analyze how we're doing it with the same kind of critical lens that I've applied to other projects. And it's certainly an added layer of complication and reflexivity in the work. But yeah, thanks for that question. Are you gonna do the microphone? Yeah, okay, cool, thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Actually, my question just leads on to what you were just talking about then around the reflexivity part. I'm curious, as someone doing the work and then being in the system of interest, how do you practically go about that reflexivity, and what have you found to be helpful from a methods perspective to really interrogate your position in the system?
Yeah, we've given so much thought to this. So actually when we first put the funding proposal together for the project, we came up with the idea of doing a collaborative autoethnography. So autoethnography is like process of ethnography, but you're sort of analyzing your own self or your own experiences. And collaborative autoethnography is like a group analyzing its own experiences in the world. And so that's been something that we had to sort of fiddle with the methods of doing that over time. So initially we had the idea that we would sort of maybe have weekly check-ins and do some collaborative writing as we went, pose each other questions, do journaling and so forth. And some of the initial things that we tried, I think we all felt sort of pressed for time, or it felt very kind of burdensome to do that ongoing work. And what actually ended up working really well was using some of the grant funding to hire one of our undergraduate students to study us. And so over the course of the project, she interviewed us frequently, every member of the team, and as you see, there's a lot of different people on the team. She would periodically interview us with a different set of questions each time. We had students observing our meetings and taking notes on the meetings, so we sort of amassed a ton of field notes and interviews about the project itself. So we haven't really begun to dig in to analyze all those data, but I think we're going to have a lot of really interesting stuff to work with. And I had to say that it's actually been, I think there's really interesting research that's coming out of that, but at the same time, just the process of knowing that we're studying ourselves and someone is interviewing us has been just really good for team cohesion as well. Right? We're checking in and thinking about each team member across the course of the project, and I think it's been a really good process in that way. Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. It's amazing, just the amount of overlaps between our research. Today we're like, oh my gosh, yes, thank you for introducing us months ago. It's very interesting to actually bring it together. And speaking of positionality and relationality, as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, because I spent several months living in Arica a few years ago.
No kidding!
And didn't know that I kind of was there. I was just checking because I'm like, so Arica used to be Bolivian territory, and then Bolivian, Peruvian territory, and then became Chilean territory, and they've been before. So Bolivia took Chile to the International Court of Justice. So they're kind of saying this is Chilean territory. I was like, oh, okay, we're saying it's just Chilean territory. Okay. Yeah. Then you went in, and because when I was there, it took months until I kind of realized. So I was just drinking the water, eating vegetables from the markets, and then a few months in, people were like, you should drink bottled water because of the arsenic contamination. And we were like, oh, okay. So we started doing that. I never heard a word about lead being when I was there. So then I was watching this going, oh my gosh. And then when you got to the one saying, oh, there's actually not really lead contamination now, it's just arsenic, I was like, phew, arsenic's fine. I'm not worried about arsenic because it's different to lead, and it's
you should be worried about arsenic too.
It's an oversimplification. But it brought to mind, and some of the stuff you're talking about, lead at the start, lead is this thing that there is no safe amount. And people argue, so I was thinking about people, even before you raised that, people talk about small exposure to arsenic potentially even being helpful, which is the narrative I heard in Arica, oh, it's fine, it's just a few months. It's just a bit of arsenic. That level of arsenic is actually kind of good for you. And we have that with uranium in Australia, right? Because we have lots of uranium just naturally in the ground. And lead, similarly, historically, that's why these mines existed. And so, and also that frame of it's natural and being with the environment versus kind of considering it toxic that needs to be fixed kind of thing. So I know that you've delved into this a bit, and so I just wanted to raise that and just be like, oh my God, we have to do it. But yeah, the natural and what's natural and tolerable levels, and the assumptions of toxicity, which so often happens with Indigenous lands, and the sense that it's actually not that valuable anyway. It's kind of just wasteland already, so another nation can just take it over, and you don't want to have that land be valued, even though it is really important to some people.
Yeah. So, yes, as you suggested, there's a lot more to say about the context in Arica. But I will just respond to the points about sort of naturally occurring arsenic and lead. So the case in Arica is complicated because there actually is a lot of naturally occurring arsenic. There are actually mummies that were found, really ancient mummies that were found in the region, and those bones were found to have contain arsenic in them. There is a lot of naturally occurring arsenic in the region. But what makes the situation with the Bolivian waste different is that it's not just arsenic, it's this combination of many different metals. And so people there call it polymetals, multiple metals. And so it's arsenic, it's lead, it's cadmium, it's a bunch of other things, and they're all coming from a lead smelter in Sweden. And so the connection with lead is not just that, well, not just the question of how much lead are we getting exposed to living around this site, but we're getting exposed to a lot of things because of lead production far away in the world. And you know, the question around, I could get into arsenic. Maybe I shouldn't talk about arsenic because it's so complicated. So the United States the EPA has set different sort of levels of, like trigger levels for action for concentrations of arsenic in soil. And the trigger level, if you're concerned about cancer risk, is so low that almost any soil has, I mean, soils everywhere have a little bit of background arsenic. And so it's always complicated to test soil and find that there's arsenic and then say, well, this surpasses the trigger level for, you know, if we're concerned about cancer risk. But then there's very little, I mean, it doesn't actually trigger any investigation, or it's considered a trigger level, but nobody does anything. And so it's one of these things where like a standard has almost become not very usable. Yeah, I won't say more about that because it's really complicated, but thank you. These are all the important things, and we should definitely talk more after this.
Abby, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk, which has just been so invigorating at the end of 2 days of lots of thinking and talking. I just wanted to come back to the concept and critique of the concept of perpetual care that you raised, and the idea that the labour of perpetual care falls to those who are most affected. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how we connect that with the call for citizen science and with the call for participation, and with the focus that we increasingly have in STS on focusing on the local as well. So how do we balance those imperatives for participation, for citizen-led work, but also acknowledging that that might actually put the burden of labour on those who are already living with the effects and labouring with the effects in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've pinpointed sort of one of the key dilemmas that I've tried to grapple with in thinking about citizen science of all sorts, and then in particular in this project. Because, I mean, I think like, both things can be true, right? On one hand, it's a good thing to have more people involved in asking and answering scientific questions and engaging and caring for their environments. All those things have really good virtues, but at the same time, it can be, those same behaviors, those same changes can be symptoms of a sort of neoliberalizing, like just we're going to devolve everything to the individual, and no one has to take responsibility for this because it's up to individuals to take care of it. And we see both of those things happening here. And so what we've tried to do in the project is to figure out ways that that doing perpetual care is actually meaningful to people, and support those kinds of work, and where people, where it's an imposition to ask people to do more work. We try to mobilize the resources that we have at our disposal working at universities, being able to go after grants, or being able to, talk to people working for the city and get resources. Recognizing that, I have more access to resources to make those kinds of activities happen than most of the participants in these projects. So I will say that my thinking about this has developed through the course of the project, because at first, when we began, I think we had a pretty strong idea that we didn't want these projects to result in sort of just an individualization of the problem, right? We didn't want soil testing to just lead to more recommendations that individuals solve these problems. And so we really focused on how can we take knowledge produced by these testing projects and move them into political action, right? How do we turn these into campaigns at the city level or state level, right, to get funding and interventions? And in Eureka, there was already, as you saw in the slides, people mobilizing to get government action. But in Troy, what we found was that there was not much appetite for that kind of work. And it wasn't that people were apathetic. All the participants are so intensely involved in trying to make their community better. But they didn't see much promise in trying to take political action, right? They've been failed many times before. And so, you know, at first I thought, oh, people are just going to do these sort of individualized solutions again. But actually what we saw emerging was more of a sense of kind of mutual aid. So collective responses, but kind of non-state responses. And so I've been really interested in thinking through that critique of perpetual care in a new light, thinking through it with the idea of mutual aid and community engagement being collaborative, but not necessarily state-oriented. That said, people need resources to do this work. So, you know, some simple things are possible, right? In Troy, the city makes wood chips, right? They collect brush and tree stumps and stuff, and they make wood chips. They provide that for free, which is amazing. Like, that's a really good resource for creating those kinds of barriers, but they don't deliver it. So most people don't have shovels or trucks or anything to get those materials. So we've been trying to figure out ways to support just moving wood chips to people who need it. It's those kind of interventions that need to not just be a one-off intervention, but actually sustained and part of our practice of caring for each other and the environment, that would make perpetual care doable and meaningful and productive, and not just a sort of individual burden that's you know, basically means it's never going to get done. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions. That's how I've been thinking through the dilemma. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, Mike Tess. So when we talk about like generation, so once the lead has actually been quenched by compost or humus, does it stay quenched forever? Or if something disturbs it, then it can be unquenched and then the soil becomes polluted again? And so what do you do with that soil? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so this is the sort of the big remediation question. So you saw in Eureka, I showed that picture where there were trucks and they were spraying hoses. Sometimes when the soil is so contaminated, the remediation solution is to just remove all that soil and bring in new soil or materials to fill in. In these more like layer building approaches, the idea is we're just sort of accelerating the natural process of building up layers of sediment, right? Building soils. But the risk always is that you're going to, you know, you're going to leave, somebody else is going to move in, and they're just going to dig it all up. And so that's where this idea of perpetual care comes in. I mean, it's similar to, maybe some of you have heard about questions about how do we store radioactive waste and communicate to people 10,000 years from now, don't dig here. Like, we're just talking about how do we tell people 5 years from now, don't dig here, and that's hard enough. So it is really a challenge. And so I think that's probably why the typical like modernist, you know, techno solution to contaminated soil is we're gonna dig it all out, we're gonna put it in a dump, we're gonna seal it over with cement, and then nobody can get to it. But most people don't want that, right? Those kinds of remediations are really disruptive, and in the process, they actually can stir up tons of contamination, distributing it throughout the community, into the air, and so yeah, I mean, it is a real dilemma, and it really does require perpetual care to maintain those, to keep the lead from being reintroduced into the environment.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to just kind of come with this question about participatory and citizen science in the context of the structural challenges you're thinking about. And it's notable you're working with Salvatore or Said, who is a really unique soil scientist, right?
Yeah, he is.
Marxist soil scientist. You don't find many of those around the world, right? But a phenomenal figure and adept at thinking those questions.
Yeah.
I'm doing a little bit of work here on the MacArthur River mine with civil and environmental engineers who are kind of grappling with how to do public interest science.
Mm.
So they're grappling with those relational sort of dynamics, like how to do science that addresses questions of lead, but also very mindful of the kind of community dynamics and not wanting to kind of just come in as a sort of saviour kind of figure.
Yeah.
And then of course funding, right? Because like when you have funding for this kind of work, right?
Yeah.
So if you could tell us where we can get some money, that's great. But also just those questions of like how to organise research teams with those kind of things in mind that don't expect the citizens to do all the work, right? That kind of sense of perhaps university research is doing significant amounts of work.
Yeah. So, yeah, I have a lot of different things to say about this. I mean, this has been a big piece of the project, is thinking about how do you form a team to do this kind of work. And, in some ways I feel really lucky that everyone on this team is really like-minded. Like in the way we think about social justice, the way we think about research serving the public and the different publics that we engage with. But some things I can say, so we were collaborating, it was a pandemic, the project started and the pandemic started. And we're at different universities and we're not able to meet in person, and we all kind of knew each other, but not really well. And we would just, we would have our regular meetings over Zoom, and it was all fine, it was going along okay. But when we finally got together all in person in Troy for the first soil workshop, and we so we were setting up an outdoor lab for the participants to work in. We couldn't do anything inside, and we were, very mindful of the spread of COVID. And so we got these big, 4-post tents to set up. And so the first task we had to do together as a research team was to figure out how to put these tents up. And, it was one of these things where you had to realize you had to have one person on each leg and then someone else directing where it would go. And it was this impromptu team building exercise that we didn't plan on. It was just practical we had to do. And I have to say, it sort of just changed the whole dynamic of the team from there on out. We just became this very tightly bonded unit that knew how to work together. And so I don't think this is really what you're asking about, but I think it's really important to actually think about building friendships in research collaborations. It's not just we have the right expertise, let's put this team together, but you actually have to be friends with each other. And we are friends now. And, silly things like putting up those tents and laughing about it was a big part of that. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, let me remember your other parts of the question. Oh, how do you get funding for this kind of thing? So we did a lot of interviews. So one of the first things we did in the project, I had this amazing postdoc, Dan Walls, and he did most of the interviews. We identified community engaged soil scientists all across the United States. And we found about 50 different projects, and we ended up choosing 30 to be, represent a wide range of geographies and different types of work, and interviewed people from those projects. And what we found, we found a lot of interesting things, but one of the really useful things we found was that everybody was struggling to get funding for community engaged research. And what would happen is it would want to continue their work supporting, helping community members sample and test soil for contaminants and find solutions to that. But that was not seen by funding bodies as novel, interesting scientific research. That's just monitoring, right? That's, we already know that lead is bad for people. Why should we, why are we going to pay for this kind of work? But when regulatory agencies aren't doing monitoring and individuals can't afford to pay for their own monitoring, it's really important that somebody does it. And so people described their strategies for getting funding for these kinds of projects. So they would treat it as sort of when they put together a grant proposal, it would be, they'd have to have some novel, cutting edge technological or scientific question, but they would build in a community engaged component of that so that they can continue working with people to test their soils. Some got funding from their universities because universities were interested in showing that they, had good community-university relations. So it would be kind of seen more as a community program. But a lot of people said they got initial funding for a project and then weren't able to sustain it. And that was a really common problem. And that's probably what's going to happen to us as well, to be honest. I've been working on another grant proposal to continue the work, and following the lead of the people we interviewed, I'm attaching it to a sexy new sensor development project that we hope to continue to also do community-based research. So it's a real challenge, and this is why I conclude that if we think that this kind of work is important, we actually have to make the case of changing the way research is supported, and our funding agencies need to look differently at both community engagement and monitoring, right? The idea that we're just monitoring the environment. Monitoring the environment is really important, but that some values have to shift around that.
Awesome, thank you so much, Abby. It's just awesome talk. And I also want to say thank you so much, Sophie, for hosting and connecting all of our questions too. That's a lot of labour. That's very much appreciated. And I think maybe partly because soil violence is here, and it's got me thinking about burdens of proof as well, and the kind of the invisible harms.
Mm-hmm.
And then seeing in your work a whole lot of maybe difficult to quantify, yet it feels like really important moments of agency building and capacity building, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say like healing in
Mm-hmm.
such an easy way, but there was one moment where you spoke about for people who had learnt who had been engaged in practices of measuring, that they also felt more able to challenge authorities. And a thing I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, when you are designing or thinking about the kinds of things and activities you're going to bring people into, both how do you know, what's your thinking about what to do and what to bring people onto, but also how do you measure those really difficult to measure, I imagine, impacts on people, in the same way as that so violence being hard at times to measure what actually mattered or what did something do.
Mm-hmm.
I guess same for the really wonderful research and participatory research that you're doing.
Thank you for this question. So, in some ways, I feel like time will tell what people will do with, the intervention that we made. But some of the things that we do in the short term to sort of document those seemingly intangible things are, just the way we approach doing these community soil studies. I think is really shaped by my, sociological sensibility of like, we're creating sort of an ethnographic experience, or we're creating maybe a focus group where we're not just sending people out to collect samples and then we're testing them and giving them results, but it's this whole process of conversation. In fact, so to describe how the workshops would work, we would usually meet at least 3 times in groups of 6 to 11 or 12 people. We first talk about, we might do a mapping activity together to talk about where people encounter soils and how they think about soils, and then decide places to collect samples. We teach people how to collect samples. And then we'll have another session where we're actually analyzing those samples. And because it's a process where, I guess I didn't really describe it in the talk, but I'll tell you a little bit. So the kits that we use, that we've developed, you take your sample of soil, you put it in an acidic solution, like in a little jar, and it has to sit for about an hour, and the acid, it's like at the same pH as your stomach, and so it's meant to sort of simulate what would happen if you ingested that soil. So you have it sit in that acid for about an hour, and then whether it's the lead test or the arsenic test, we add a reagent that will produce a color change. And so in the lead test, if there's any lead present there, it will turn purple, and the depth of the color purple will indicate the concentration, approximate concentration of lead there. But in all of that, there's a lot of time. You're waiting, right? You're waiting for things to happen. And so what we try to do in those moments is facilitate conversations about what people are worried about, what they hope. People go around and they look at each other's soil samples and note things like, oh, this is a totally different color than my soil sample. And so what we did is, I just approached it like an ethnographer. So I had students who were taking notes on everything, and people taking photographs and video. And so we're just thinking about those encounters as these interesting things to observe and understand how people's thinking changes over that period of time. And then after we get the results, we have yet another community meeting, which is all just about putting the results in some kind of context. So thinking about, first of all, remediation strategies, but also sort of political strategies. We use something called the socio-ecological model of health, where we're sort of thinking about from local, like the individual body, all the way out to the larger political system and world that we live in, all these different nested scales. Think about interventions we can make to create healthier soils at all those different scales. And so I think in those interventions, we can sort of observe how people are making sense of the information about soil that they've gained. And we continue to follow up and remain in contact with everybody. Like I said, we're going back to Eureka, and we'll learn again. I've also done follow-up interviews with a lot of people who participated. And so, because it's really important to us to understand, like, what does this kind of work do? Like, it feels good in the moment to do this kind of stuff, but does it mean a lot to people over the long run? And one thing that's pretty interesting, I think, is the different kinds of outcomes that you get when you are going into like an already really politicized space, like we found in Eureka, where people had been organizing for a long time against the toxic waste situation, and the situation I described in Troy, where people are very concerned about lead exposure, but don't feel a lot of agency to work collaboratively. Like, there's not a lot of collective action already. So I think it'll be really interesting to actually make some systematic comparisons about how doing very similar interventions in those two places might produce different kinds of outcomes.
We have come to time, so I think we might have to end there, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We can chat more informally later.
I feel like we're not quite finished, and in fact there is an opportunity to keep talking. We've got some space at the Roundhouse booked now for drinks, if anyone's available. Abby is going to be around for another couple of months in Sydney, and I'm sure would welcome people getting in touch.
Absolutely. My contact info is there. Send me an email. We'll talk again. Yeah, great. And let's go have drinks.
Thank you so much, Abby.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. It's been a wonderful lecture.